In 1994, in the small town of New Haven in the state of New York, 18-year-old Heidi Allen was abducted from the store where she worked. Two brothers were accused of her kidnapping, but two separate trials led to paradoxical outcomes. All charges were dropped against one brother, while the other was found guilty. However, if you thought, well, at least they caught the guy who did it, by the end of this story, you'll likely change your opinion. On April 3, 1994, Easter Sunday, 18-year-old Heidi Allen began her shift at the convenience store attached to the D&W gas station in New Haven, a town in Oswego County, New York. Heidi was a determined and energetic young woman with ambitions of building a career in education or psychological counseling. Devoting much of her time to sports, her tall and robust build made her an invaluable member of volleyball and other teams. Despite her athletic prowess, she maintained a friendly demeanor, and everyone noted her warmth and responsiveness. Heidi had been working at D&W for over 2 years. It was her day off, but she agreed to cover a shift so that her colleague could spend the day with her children. Heidi's shift began at 5:45, and she arrived at work with her boyfriend. This was not unusual, as he often accompanied her to ensure she felt safe while opening the store very early in the morning. Typically, he would wait until the first customers arrived and then go about his day. That's exactly how it played out on April 3rd. Another customer entered the store but didn't see any staff. It might have seemed like the store was closed, but the gas pumps were operational and the lights were on inside. The customer went outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. Sheriff's deputies entered the store, finding everything seemingly in order. There was money in the cash register, and $9.50 was on the counter, left by another customer as payment for fuel and a newspaper. There were no signs of struggle or apparent issues. A security alarm was located under the counter, but it hadn't triggered that day. The officers discovered Heidi's car parked on the street, and her purse and car keys were still in the store. Despite the absence of signs of a struggle, the sheriff's deputies concluded that she might have been abducted, and the search for her began immediately. The state police offered assistance to the sheriff's office in Oswego County with the search for the missing girl. They had the resources to block all exits and ensure the abductor wouldn't escape. However, the sheriff inexplicably declined the offer, stating that his team could handle it on their own. Officers checked the punched receipts at the store's cash register and discovered that the last purchase was made at 7:42 when someone bought 2 packs of cigarettes. It was crucial to find this customer, as they were the last person to see the girl at work. Fortunately, the search for this individual didn't take much time. As soon as the news of Heidi's presumed abduction spread through the town, a man named Richard Thibodeau called the police. He claimed to be the one who was in the store that morning. The girl sold him cigarettes, and he left afterward. When extensive searches for the girl began, local residents, including Richard Thibodeau, his brother Gary, and his wife Teresa, joined in. Around the same time, Christopher Bivens contacted the police, describing how he drove past the store and saw 2 men leading a tall young woman toward a van. He thought one of the men was holding the woman tightly. He admitted he didn't remember the appearance of the van or the men, but noted that they were quite tall. Despite Richard Thibodeau voluntarily contacting the police and assisting in the search for the girl, law enforcement grew suspicious of him due to the timing of his purchase, just minutes before the concerned customer approached the sheriff's deputies. Additionally, he drove a van similar to the one described by Christopher. The police searched Richard's van, but nothing connecting the vehicle or its owner to Heidi was found. Richard willingly provided his fingerprints, blood samples, and hair without objection. Due to suspicions surrounding Richard, investigators turned a closer eye to his brother, Gary Thibodeau. After all, Christopher Bivens saw 2 men taking the young woman out of the store. Gary explained to detectives that he was still sleeping at home that early morning, and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. A month later, the police charged Richard Thibodeau with the abduction. Gary was also taken into custody, albeit for a different minor offense unrelated to Heidi's disappearance. While he was in jail, law enforcement managed to build a case against the brothers. Suddenly, 2 inmates emerged, claiming that Gary had said Heidi was no more and she would never be found. Thus, detectives arrested a man who had voluntarily called the police and reported being in the store that morning. Despite no evidence against him, Richard willingly provided all the necessary samples and underwent a polygraph test. However, it seemed to have little significance. Richard and his brother Gary, a person with an alibi, were charged with first-degree kidnapping. A jury trial was conducted separately for Gary Thibodeau. During the trial, no concrete evidence or forensic testimony was presented, and Heidi was still missing. However, the prosecution was confident in their case. They called a witness who had seen two men with a girl near the store that morning, and jury members heard the statements of two inmates regarding Gary's alleged remarks about Heidi. Although the information provided by the two convicted individuals contradicted not only each other but also established facts at that time, they were allowed to testify in court. The jurors heard that Heidi disappeared within just 13 minutes between the last recorded cigarette sale and the arrival of sheriff's deputies at the store. During these 13 minutes, the witness saw two men leading the young woman to a car. He described the vehicle as a white van with two dark blue or black doors at the back and two doors of the same color on the right side, along with a wide 6-inch black stripe above the wheels. The same witness, Christopher Bivens, identified the van as the one driven by Richard. However, it's crucial to note the interesting evolution in the testimony of this key prosecution witness. Initially, he could hardly recall anything about the men or the van where Heidi was supposedly placed. Suddenly, he could remember minute details, and the height of the men decreased to match the Thibodeau brothers' heights. Another customer from the store was called to testify. He made a purchase at 7:41, just a minute before Richard bought 2 packs of cigarettes. The man explained that there was a running van in the parking lot, and he assumed it was Richard's. He saw Richard in the store and, for some reason, believed there were 2 men in the van. Essentially, his testimony merely confirmed that Richard Thibodeau was in the store, a fact that Richard did not deny. A 13-year-old girl also provided testimony, claiming to have seen Richard's van parked at Gary's house shortly after Heidi Allen's disappearance. The girl insisted she remembered this because it was Easter Sunday. She had just woken up and looked out the window to see the van. However, after the trial, she recanted her statements, admitting that it could have been a dream. This constituted the evidence presented by the sheriff's deputies. The prosecutors had no concrete evidence linking the Thibodeau brothers to the abduction, no motive for the crime, and no logical explanation for why Richard Thibodeau would buy cigarettes if he intended to abduct the girl. Why not simply pocket the cigarettes when he and his brother allegedly took Heidi out of the store? Despite all this, Gary Thibodeau was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. During Richard's trial, nearly all the same evidence was presented, except for the testimony of the 2 inmates. However, since a different judge presided over the case, and there were different jurors, the outcome of the trial turned out to be entirely different. All charges against Richard were dropped. Richard returned to his family, while Gary began serving his sentence in prison. Gradually, the case of Heidi Allen's abduction began to fade from memory until an unexpected turn occurred in February 2013. A woman named Tanya Priest called the police, claiming she needed to unburden her conscience. She recounted a conversation that took place in 2006 when she gave a ride to her friend Victoria West to the trailer home where she lived with her boyfriend James Steen. The couple invited her inside, and as they chatted about random topics, a news segment about Heidi aired on TV. The girls started discussing what might have happened to her when James suddenly said, "Do you really want to know?" and began his story. It was the last thing the girls expected to hear. Steen revealed that he, along with 2 friends, Roger Breckenridge and Michael Borer, had abducted Heidi that day, taking her out of the store and putting her into Michael Borer's van. Borer was waiting in the van, meaning that 2 men took the girl out of the store, just as witness Christopher Bivens had claimed. The men then drove Heidi to the trailer home of Breckenridge's girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott, on Rice Road in the town of Mexico, Oswego County. Steen added that they had long gotten rid of that van, but the body could still be found in a shed in the woods across from where the trailer had been located. When asked why they had committed such a grave act, Steen explained that Heidi was planning to report to the police their involvement in illegal drug trafficking. At first, the friends didn't believe Steen, thinking he wouldn't harm a fly. However, a few years later, when Steen killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, who happened to be his cousin, out of jealousy, Tanya Priest was no longer sure that Steen was so harmless. Interestingly, the police initially hesitated to believe Tanya Priest's words, but she was determined not to give up, and the officers eventually yielded to her persistent requests to investigate this version. They assisted Tanya in secretly recording a phone conversation with Roger Breckenridge's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott. In the phone conversation, Westcott admitted knowing about what happened to Heidi Allen and went so far as to say that the men didn't bring the abducted girl into her trailer, but left her in the van. However, when sheriff's deputies questioned Jennifer and presented her with the recording, she evaded and claimed she just wanted to quickly end the conversation with Tanya, agreeing with everything she said. During a polygraph test, she lied about knowing who abducted Heidi Allen. Despite this information, law enforcement did not actively pursue the case. At this point, Tanya reached out to Gary Thibodeau's lawyer because by then, she was convinced of his innocence and wanted to help him secure his release. It's worth noting that the main problem in this case has always been the motive behind the crime. It's entirely unclear why the Thibodeau brothers would kidnap a girl they barely knew. Similarly, the motive for three men to take such a heavy burden upon themselves remains unclear. However, it turns out that such a motive could exist, and law enforcement authorities did not want the truth to come to light. Heidi Allen, an 18-year-old employee at the gas station convenience store, had been a police informant for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl got into trouble when she was caught by the police during a party her sister wanted to attend. As she was a minor and had put a child who was with her in the car in a dangerous situation, Heidi faced significant problems. In exchange for dropping all charges, the 15-year-old girl made a deal and became a police informant. Although she was a confidential informant, her status was revealed by a bizarre accident. Before she disappeared, Heidi worked with a sheriff's assistant, Chris Van Patten, who accidentally dropped her informant card with a photo and the codename Julia Roberts near the store where she worked. The card was found by Heidi's colleague, Kristen Duell, who returned it to the police. Kristen claimed that she only told her mother about it. But even if the girl told the truth, it is unknown how long the card lay on the ground and how many bystanders could see it. Inmates who testified in court against Gary Thibodeau claimed that Heidi was worried about Gary because he was planning to involve her in illegal dealings with controlled substances. However, firstly, one of these inmates later recanted his statement. Secondly, Heidi's diary was found, where she detailed her life, and there was not a single mention of the Thibodeau brothers. Thirdly, the information that Heidi was, in fact, an informant, allows for the dismissal of these baseless insinuations. The newly revealed information provided an alternative theory about Heidi's abduction, especially considering that her status was compromised, and dangerous people could have learned that she worked for the police. Considering the new details, in 2014, after persistent demands from Gary's lawyers, searches were conducted in 2 cabins in the woods. One was literally opposite the place where Jennifer Westcott lived. Search dogs indicated the potential presence of remains near the cabin. Police found fresh shoe tracks at the site, and inside it was evident that someone had already dismantled the floorboards. However, the forensic examination conducted by the Bureau of Forensic Services did not detect any human remains. It's interesting that when Tanya Priest decided to share what she knew, numerous witnesses from the town immediately came forward, claiming to have heard James Steen, Michael Borer, and Roger Breckenridge boasting about Heidi's abduction. Some of these witnesses asserted that they had reported this to the police on multiple occasions. Even the key prosecution witness, Christopher Bivens, stated that Steen and Breckenridge looked much more like the individuals leading the girl out of the store. However, as he had never seen their photos before, he considered the Tibbett brothers as possible abductors. Around the same time, it was revealed that in 2004, Heidi's cousin, Melissa Searles, found an envelope in her mailbox containing a gold bracelet she had once gifted to Heidi. The envelope had no postage stamp, indicating that it wasn't sent through the mail, but was personally placed in the mailbox. Melissa claimed that she had not reported this discovery to the police for years because the entire family believed Heidi's abductor was already in prison, and there was no need to reopen the case. However, with the new abduction theory, she apparently felt compelled to share this information. In 2015, the appeal process regarding Gary's accusation began. The defense insisted on a new trial due to a wealth of newly revealed information. 52 witnesses, including 3 considered potential new suspects, testified. A key witness was a woman who drove past the DNW store around 6 a.m. on April 3, 1994. She reported seeing an old, rust-covered van with no black stripe down the middle, confirming that it wasn't Richard Thibodeau's van. The defense tried to argue that the three men kidnapped the girl, forcing her into Michael Bohr's van, and took her to a cabin in the woods because they feared she would report them to the police. The men, of course, denied everything, but Michael Bohr slipped up by mentioning seeing Heidi's informant card near the store. Furthermore, Bohr told law enforcement that he wasn't a cruel person, so he couldn't have committed such a crime. However, this was untrue. Michael Bohr had previously been accused of kidnapping a young girl, making him, unlike the Thibodeau brothers, capable of such a crime. What's intriguing is that he was obsessed with this case, collecting a whole box of materials related to Heidi's abduction. One entry in his notes was particularly intriguing. He wrote as if a psychic told him that Heidi hid the bracelet behind the car seat. She added that Heidi hid an item where she was held, and all her family members would recognize it. Despite the abundance of new information, Gary lost the appeal after a year of hearings, and he was denied the opportunity for a new trial. From 2015 to 2018, subsequent judicial decisions also prohibited presenting new evidence due to doubts about the reliability of witnesses and the lack of sufficient proof to substantiate the alleged confessions of the three men. None of the three, James Stein, Michael Bohr, or Roger Breckenridge, were charged in connection with Heidi's disappearance. Perhaps if Gary's lawyers had known about another crucial lead, they might have persuaded the judge to allow a new trial. The prosecutor informed the defense that he had provided them with all case materials. However, on December 13, 1994, he explicitly prohibited copying documents from a specific folder for the defense attorneys. Inside were two letters from the globally renowned expert in determining truthfulness, Murray Myron. His services were often sought by FBI agents, and he was asked to speak with a witness who might be the one who saw Heidi after her abduction. The expert concluded that Brent Moore's account of specific events related to Heidi was truthful and accurate. He did witness her being transported in a van, and she found refuge in a garage on the Barlow property in the town of Scriba. Brent was only 3 years old at the time of Heidi's abduction, and the expert was invited to verify whether the boy was telling the truth about the events of that day. The expert talked to the child, analyzed his drawings, and believed him. He advised looking for Heidi where the boy indicated. Interestingly, Brent knew Heidi before the abduction. His mother mentioned that during the Christmas holidays, after a visit to Richard Mitten, the boy's father, Brent mentioned seeing Heidi and that she gave money to Richard. When shown a photo of Heidi, the boy immediately recognized her and called her by name. Additionally, he accurately described her car. Brent added that 3 friends of his father were involved in Heidi's abduction, and the boy's mother remembered a conversation with her ex-husband on Easter Sunday in 1994, the day Heidi disappeared. She recalled how Richard suddenly claimed that 3 boys had kidnapped her. Who they were and whether they knew that Heidi was an informant is unknown. Investigators attempted to search the garage indicated by the boy, but couldn't conduct the search on either the garage or the adjacent area due to the lack of a warrant, and the homeowner did not allow the search. As evident, there are several theories about what might have happened to Heidi Allen besides the police's version implicating the Tibbets brothers. It's possible that Stein, Breckenridge, and Bohr were the kidnappers, or perhaps friends of Brent Moore's father were involved. Since the girl was not found, there's also a more optimistic version suggesting that she entered a witness protection program. What if the police realized the danger they put Heidi in by making a teenager a confidential informant and then compromising her status? This could explain many unexplained aspects of the case. The appearance of her bracelet, the lack of signs of struggle in the store, the absence of evidence clearly pointing to any of the suspects. One might want to believe that she had to leave her family, but no one kidnapped her, and she is enjoying life somewhere in this world. Although one thing can be asserted almost certainly, when the sheriff's assistant dropped Heidi's informant card, he put an end to the life she had led until the age of 18. What truly happened on the morning of Sunday, April 3, 1994, remains unknown. It's possible that we may never find out. What we do know is that Gary maintained his innocence until his last breath. Gary Thibodeau passed away on August 12, 2018, at the age of 64, and his health did not allow him to live the additional 2 years to a potential conditional early release. Gary's departure means he will no longer have a chance to clear his name. Hope for another appeal in federal court died with him. He will remain a convicted inmate who abducted an 18-year-old girl and, according to many, is the second victim of this terrible and convoluted crime. Every year in Sweden, approximately 26,000 people go missing. 97% of them are found shortly after their disappearance, about 2,700 of whom are deceased. The fate of the remaining 3% remains unknown. However, from time to time, when a person disappears, events unfold that are so unbelievable that they defy any logic. The disappearance of Linda Chen is one of such stories. On August 1st, 2009, Linda Chen and her fiancé Mats Alm returned home after a pleasant trip around the region. They were exploring attractions of interest to Linda's relatives, who would be attending their wedding in 2 weeks. After dinner, Linda left the apartment to meet a friend and disappeared. The police began their investigation, examining all leads. On September 16th, officers knocked on Mats's door to ask him additional questions, but they discovered that he had also vanished without a trace. 2 days later, a call came into the rescue service. The caller had just found Mats, shirtless and barefoot, in a panic, emerging from the forest. Mats explained that he had been abducted by 2 Chinese men who were after Linda's money. The kidnappers drugged him, placed him in the trunk of a car, and then brought him to the forest where he woke up engulfed in flames. Next to him was the body of his fiancée, Linda Chen. Linda Chen was born in 1977 in China. When she was 15 years old, her family sent her and her 12-year-old brother to Sweden, where they lived in a refugee camp. There, she met Aino Johansson, who became a second mother to Linda. Aino describes Linda as a sociable girl who was interested in fashion and enjoyed karaoke. After receiving an education, Linda became a nurse and got married. In 1998, their family welcomed a son named Alexander. However, the marriage fell apart when her husband attempted to kill Linda. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder. In her next marriage, she received $35,000. Her husband paid her this amount for a sham marriage, which allowed him to obtain a green card. For the third time, she got married to a chef from Falun, Sweden. Linda left her nursing job and took on a part-time role as a waitress at the China Thai restaurant. Although she divorced her husband after a few years, she continued working at the restaurant. By 2008, Linda found herself single again. She turned to online dating sites where she met Mats Alm. Born in 1975, Mats had a fairly typical childhood in Sweden. After finishing school, he joined the army but later served as a firefighter. He then worked at a store in Peru where he got engaged to a woman. Facing financial difficulties for their wedding, he resorted to embezzlement from work. They got married but soon divorced after Mats was arrested for stealing $10,000. He returned to Falun, Sweden, burdened with numerous debts and loans. Despite his financial troubles, he took on additional student loans to become a teacher. It was during this challenging period that he met Linda. On their first date, they discussed marriage, and a few weeks later, Mats moved in with Linda. Linda held traditional values and believed that if they were to live together, they should at least plan for a wedding. Therefore, just 2 months after their first date, they became engaged. Mats recalls proposing on May 5, 2008, although Linda's friends insist that she brought up the question. On May 12th, just a week after their engagement, they took out insurance policies, naming each other as beneficiaries. The policies were worth $125,000. Linda also drafted a will, leaving everything to Mats. She didn't want her son's father to receive anything from Alexander's inheritance if she were to pass away before he turned 18. So, Linda instructed her fiancé that in case something happened to her, he should place the money in a trust account and give it to the boy when he goes to college. Meanwhile, Linda also paid off a significant portion of Mats's debts and provided him with money for personal expenses. In June 2009, the couple embarked on a month-long trip to China to visit Linda's family. The trip cost more than $10,000, and she covered all the expenses. She also took on the costs of the wedding, $6,000. A week before the wedding on August 1st, Linda finished her shift and came home. At 16:38, she and Mats were caught on a surveillance camera as they exited a grocery store. Linda was wearing a short white dress, white leggings, and high-heeled sandals. She looked perfectly happy, holding Mats's hand and smiling. Everything else known about that day and the subsequent months comes from Mats's account. The next day, Mats reported Linda's disappearance. He stated that after leaving the store, they went home and unpacked their groceries. Then they drove around the area, visiting tourist attractions of interest to their wedding guests who were to arrive the following week. They started by going to Torsang's Cafe, known for its unique steamboat attraction. Credit card transactions indeed confirmed this trip, but on July 30th. Next, They visited the location where the wedding ceremony was supposed to take place. Matz claimed it was quiet there, and they simply strolled around. However, the police later established that a large family celebration was happening there that day, and no one saw Matz or Linda. At 20 o'clock, they returned home, and Linda reheated the spring rolls she brought from work. They had dinner. It seems that Matz was indeed home at that time since his computer was turned on at 20:20. Linda had a meeting with a friend at 9 o'clock, so she washed her hair, applied fresh makeup, and left. She wore the same white dress and leggings she had been wearing all day. Her family and friends found it strange that someone who cared about fashion wouldn't change clothes, wash her hair, and redo her makeup before a meeting. It was very unlike her. That evening, no one saw Linda on the street or in any bar or restaurant, although it would have been hard to miss a petite Asian woman standing at 147 centimeters tall. Many people knew her due to her work at China Thai. After 1 a.m., Matt sent Linda a message and called her, but received no response. He intermittently called her throughout the night. At 9 a.m., he contacted the police, but they asked him to call back later, assuming that Linda had simply fallen asleep at a friend's house. At 10:44 a.m., he called the police again, and they advised him to check with her friends. At 1 p.m., he finally called Linda's alleged rendezvous partner, Tony Chen. Tony told Matz that he hadn't seen Linda that evening and that they hadn't even planned to meet. Matz dialed his fiancée's mobile phone 8 more times before he called the police for the 3rd time and told them the whole story about her not showing up for the meeting with Tony. Now the police began their investigation. When Linda didn't show up for work on Sunday, her colleagues realized that something was amiss. The news of Linda's disappearance made its way into newspapers, and television stations also picked up the story. That's how most of her acquaintances learned about her disappearance, because Matz didn't bother to inform them. Even Aino Johansson found out about Linda's disappearance from the media. It could have been assumed that Matz would check if she had heard anything about their adopted daughter before announcing her disappearance. When Aino finally called Matz herself, his voice sounded very upbeat. "I'm so glad you called," he exclaimed. Aino found his behavior quite unnerving. Meanwhile, investigators spoke with Tony Chen. He reiterated what he had told Matz and added that he only knew Linda as a colleague from the China Thai restaurant. He mentioned that he had never met her outside of the establishment when he was there with friends. Linda's former husband, the father of her son, was also invited for questioning, but he had a very solid alibi for the evening of Linda's disappearance. On August the 7th, Linda's relatives began arriving for the wedding. Matz greeted them and gave them a city tour. He showed them photos they had taken with Linda in China, appeared happy, and didn't even mention that Linda was missing. They learned about it from the news. On August 8th, Linda's friends and relatives gathered in the church where the wedding was planned to take place. They came together to pray and light candles, not knowing if she was alive, if she needed help, and everyone was deeply concerned and worried, except for the groom. Matz's relatives were also in the church, but he sat next to Aino Johansson. When the priest lit a candle and prayed for Linda, Matz leaned towards Aino and whispered, "How does the priest know Linda is dead?" After the service, Matz went to a local bar with his friends, where he enjoyed himself and drank. Needless to say, his behavior seemed more than just strange to many. The investigators quickly determined that despite their wedding plans, neither the groom nor the bride had made any orders for food or flowers. Could they have foreseen this? According to Linda's friends, it was unlikely. She was enthusiastic about the upcoming wedding and looked forward to the day. Did detectives need to explore other scenarios, like planning errors or financial difficulties? Did Linda's disappearance fit into any of these scenarios? Meanwhile, Matz had started working as a substitute teacher. He appeared to be in a cheerful mood, and none of his colleagues had any idea that his fiancée had gone missing. Aino Johansson maintained contact with the groom, her adopted daughter's fiancé, and would periodically call him. During one of their conversations, Matz asked how much time must pass before a missing person is declared dead. She suggested it could take up to 10 years. He responded that he couldn't wait that long. On September 2nd, Matz appeared on a TV show called Searching, discussing Linda's disappearance. He didn't shy away from speculating about the worst possible outcomes regarding what might have happened to her, including involvement with the Chinese mafia and human traffickers. He made a few odd statements, such as claiming to cry all day long even if he only drank 1 glass of water that day. He concluded by saying that he found crying useless because it didn't help. Interestingly, in this TV show, there's always an expert who assesses the words of both the victim and the suspect. In this episode, former criminology professor Leif G.W. Persson bluntly stated that the most likely culprit was Linda's fiancé. Later, when the police searched Mats's apartment, they found printed pages of Persson's comments and Mats's own notes on them. His appearance on the show didn't yield any significant results, as no new leads or witnesses emerged. On Tuesday, September 15th, the police called Mats and asked him to come to the station to answer additional questions. According to his colleagues, the call clearly unsettled and upset him. As you might guess, he didn't show up at the police station the next day. Officers went to his home, but he wasn't there either. They had to consider the possibility that he had disappeared by his own volition or someone had abducted him. The media picked up on this story, reporting on the disappearance of Mats Alm, but nobody knew his whereabouts. However, on September 18th, an unusual call came in to the emergency services. A man reported that he had been kidnapped, held hostage in a car trunk, and set on fire. Lars Goffen was near his cabin in the woods when he saw a shirtless and shoeless man running towards him. This alone indicated that something was wrong. After contacting the rescue service, Lars brought water and a blanket for Mats, and they sat and waited for the police and ambulance to arrive. The arriving officers asked Mats how he ended up in the woods, and he told them an unbelievable story. On September 15th, after work, Mats bought a pizza and headed home. He planned to spend the evening in front of the TV when a knock on the door interrupted him. Peering through the peephole, Mats thought it was Tony Chen. He opened the door only to find two Chinese men, neither of whom was Tony. They barged into the apartment. Threatening him with a knife, they forced Mats to swallow 2 pills, promising to take him to Linda. After taking the pills, Mats fell asleep on the couch. He woke up in the car trunk the next evening. When he knocked on the trunk, the kidnappers opened it and demanded to know where Linda's money was. Mats had no idea about any money. They gave him 2 more pills and closed the trunk. Interestingly, at the same time, someone used Mats's camera to take pictures of landmarks in Stockholm, including a selfie that resembled Mats. The next morning, the man woke up in the trunk and began screaming. He told the kidnappers that he needed to relieve himself and was hungry. The Chinese gave him a cup and fed him, of course, with Chinese takeout. When Mats again refused to reveal where Linda's money was, he was given 2 more pills. Meanwhile, someone used Mats's laptop to connect to the Wi-Fi at a library in Stockholm. This unknown person, whoever they might be, was searching for Mats's ex-wife, his former student, and a school friend. The next morning, Mats woke up in the trunk again and asked to use the restroom. The kidnappers allowed him to do so and then gave him more pills. While Mats was in the trunk, his laptop connected to Wi-Fi on a bus in Stockholm. This was observed by several witnesses, including the bus driver, who saw a man using the laptop that looked very much like Mats. Finally, on August 18th, the now conscious hostage asked for water. The 2 kidnappers, who had stood by the car in the woods for 3 days for some inexplicable reason, gave him a bottle of water and more pills. Around noon, witnesses in the village of Tallberg reported seeing a man who strikingly resembled Mats, whose disappearance had been widely publicized. On the same day, at 4:30 p.m., Mats opened his eyes and found himself on the ground in the woods. Realizing he was on fire, he tore off his shirt and put out the fire on his pants. Seeing Linda's body in a white dress under the branches, he understood what had happened. He started running to seek help. He ran until he reached a road about 20 miles north of Falun. As no passing cars stopped, he sprinted to a cabin owned by Lars Goffen. Lars called the police. Mats received medical attention at the hospital. His burns were not too serious. The toxicology report showed no traces of medication in his system. Additionally, the doctor stated that if Mats had been in the trunk for so long, there would have been signs of trauma on his body. In early November, approximately 1.5 months after the discovery of Linda, Mats's father contacted the police, stating that he had found some strange items at home that they should see. These turned out to be Mats's laptop and camera, as well as a handwritten letter. The laptop provided crucial evidence to prove that Mats had searched multiple times on the search engine for information on how to leave Sweden without money. It also allowed investigators to track the man's movements in Stockholm while he was supposedly confined in the trunk by the cruel kidnappers. Selfies and other photographs from Stockholm were found on the phone. In the letter addressed to his parents, he wrote the following: Hello, Mom and Dad. If you are reading this letter, it means that something has happened to me. I think the people I am trying to track down, the people responsible for Linda's disappearance, got rid of me. I think I'm getting close to solving it, so I will hide some important things here. If not, I will retrieve them later myself and be able to use the laptop during visits. Love you both with all my heart, Mats. The police believe that Mats left these items at his parents' house on September 18th, presumably while he was held against his will. The investigators presented the man with the selfie on his phone and asked how he could be in two places at once. He replied that while the man in the photo strongly resembled him, it wasn't his hat, so it wasn't him. According to him, the Chinese mafia had hired someone who looked like him to roam around Sweden and set him up for Linda's murder, even though he was actually in captivity by the kidnappers. He couldn't explain why the mafia initially wanted to frame him for the murder of his fiancée, but then decided to kill her in the same location where Linda's body was found. Perhaps their plans changed. Adhering to a consistent story, he stated that he didn't write the letter found at his parents' house. Despite both his parents' and handwriting analysis confirming that he was the author, he maintained that it wasn't his writing. The man was, of course, arrested. However, since Linda's body had been in the woods for a prolonged period, the forensic pathologist couldn't determine the exact date of death. They could only conclude that she had passed away between August 1st and 9th. Due to this limitation, it was impossible to establish how she died, let alone prove that a murder had taken place. Forensic experts were able to ascertain that it was Mats who moved and hid Linda's body. Therefore, he was charged with tampering with a body and sentenced to 1.5 years of imprisonment. However, as he had been in custody prior to the verdict, he was released immediately after the trial. What exactly happened to Linda is something we may never know. It's possible that she became disillusioned when Mats exceeded the budget for their wedding and failed to arrange catering and flowers. According to Person's opinion, an argument escalated, and Mats strangled her. This was further supported by a red mark on his neck during those days, as if he had been in a fight, although he couldn't explain its origin. On the other hand, it could have been an unfortunate accident. Perhaps Linda had a heart attack, and Mats panicked. Even the most extreme theory cannot be debunked, suggesting that Linda asked to be killed herself in order for her son to receive insurance money. While highly unlikely, when the cause of death cannot be established, it's impossible to accuse anyone of murder without knowing exactly what happened. It is more likely that Mats disposed of Linda's body on the night of her disappearance, even before they returned from the store where they were captured on surveillance cameras. Judging from his online search queries, he initially considered fleeing the country, but when he realized it was not feasible without money, he came up with a different plan. He realized that until Linda's body was found, she wouldn't be declared deceased, and therefore he wouldn't receive the insurance money for several more years. So he concocted a story about being kidnapped and taken to the woods, where Linda's body lay. Again, according to Leif Person's theory, he didn't even intend to set himself on fire, but his clothes caught fire when he attempted to burn Linda's body. Regardless, all of these are mere speculations. Perhaps most unsettling of all is the fact that after his release, Mats did receive the insurance money from Linda's policy. However, his lawyer managed to persuade him to give the money to Linda's son. It's a small silver lining in this horrific case. Of course, no amount of money can bring back a mother, but at least her son can start his adult life with a greater sense of financial security.
It was the beginning of a warm summer evening in Princess Beatrix Park in Schiedam, Netherlands, when a small naked boy emerged from the dense bushes with a shoe hanging from his bloodied neck. The boy, Michael, had turned 11 just a few days earlier. Staggering with difficulty, he made his way toward a nearby bridge and cried out for help. A man cycling home from work was horrified when he spotted Michael. He immediately contacted emergency services and reported that something terrible had happened in the park and that an ambulance and police were urgently needed. There was another child lying in the bushes. After school on June 22, 2000, 10-year-old Ninky and 11-year-old Michael got on their bicycles and rode to Princess Beatrix Park. They left their bikes near the rear entrance of the petting zoo. On such a warm summer day, they happily splashed around in the water at the Fort Drakenstein-themed playground. However, they remembered that they had to be home for dinner by 5:30 p.m. Ninka's family had invited Michael to have dinner with them. The children asked a park employee what time it was, and when they learned that it was already 5:15 p.m. and that they had only 15 minutes left, they headed back toward their bicycles. By that time, the petting zoo had already closed. As Ninky and Michael approached their bicycles near the rear entrance, someone suddenly grabbed them from behind by the necks and forced them into the dense undergrowth of the park. There, the children got a look at their attacker, a young man they had never seen before. Threatening them with a knife, he forced both children to remove their clothes. A brief delay occurred because Michael was wearing high-top boots with long laces. Losing patience, the attacker began helping him take them off. He himself remained fully clothed. While they were struggling with their clothing, a passerby walking a black and white dog went past the bushes. The passerby did not notice them, but this moment prompted the attacker to force the children even deeper into the undergrowth, about 90 meters from the path. There, the situation escalated into a violent assault while the attacker watched. Afterward, he turned on Michael. The boy suffered severe injuries and lost consciousness. Michael was in pain and bleeding heavily, but he managed to remain motionless and pretend to be dead. The attacker then turned his attention to the girl. Michael could not see what happened to his friend, but he could hear them. Despite her desperate resistance, the attacker was, of course, stronger. Michael heard her struggle for some time until a frightening, oppressive silence fell. The stranger then ended the girl's life with a shoelace. Michael heard the killer say, "Yes, go to your friend, fall asleep. Your friend is already gone." Then he tightened the second lace, which was still threaded through several loops of the boot, around Michael's neck. He wanted to ensure that the second victim was dead before he left the attack site. Michael did not rush to move. It seemed to him that 20 to 30 minutes had passed before he dared to move again. Then, despite his severe injuries and overwhelming pain, he staggered out of the bushes and attracted the attention of a passerby standing nearby on a small bridge. That person stopped another man who was passing by on a bicycle, and at exactly 6:08 p.m. the cyclist called emergency services to report that medical assistance and police were needed. When police flooded the park 7 minutes later, they discovered the lifeless body of Ninka Kleiss in the bushes. The following day, the police held a press conference, announcing that Ninky Kleiss had been murdered and that Michael was seriously injured. The public was horrified, as the crime had taken place in broad daylight in a park that is usually full of people. Pressure on the police was immense. People demanded that the perpetrator who had attacked the children be put behind bars as quickly as possible. Detectives interviewed witnesses one after another. Forensic teams combed the crime scene in search of DNA samples, fingerprints, hair, and other evidence. Investigators also spoke with Michael. It was a miracle that the boy had survived such an attack. As experts explained, he had entered a state in psychology known as a freeze response. This is an evolutionarily ancient survival mechanism in which the nervous system reacts to extreme stress or threat, not by fighting or fleeing, but by shutting down movement and responsiveness. Similar behavior can be seen in terrified animals when they are caught by a predator. This reflex in Michael was so strong that he did not move even when the attacker stabbed him multiple times to check whether he was still alive. That is what ultimately saved his life. Michael provided a very detailed description of the attacker, especially his face. The boy said that the person who attacked him and Ninke was a young man, no older than 35. But most likely much younger, closer to 20. He was fairly tall, slim, and not very well groomed, resembling someone with a drug addiction, possibly even homeless. The attacker was wearing a dark, most likely leather jacket and a baseball cap. He had a gold piercing in one ear and short tousled hair, but the most distinctive feature was his face. He clearly suffered from acne. His unusually pale skin showed many fresh breakouts as well as older, scratched and scarred marks. The police shared this description with the media, and a flood of calls came into the hotline. But the suspect could not be found. Because the police were unable to identify the killer despite all efforts, doubts began to arise about Michael's statements. Investigators considered the possibility that the boy might be withholding information out of shame. For example, that he and Ninke might have been engaged in some kind of sexual play in the bushes when they were suddenly attacked. The police went even further and began to suspect that Michael might have been an accomplice, or at least someone protecting a known perpetrator. The detectives simply couldn't understand how Michael could talk completely calmly about the most emotional moments of the attack, yet become angry or start crying whenever the police tried to clarify certain details or pointed out inconsistencies in his account. The boy's strange behavior was not limited to that. Michael looked the detectives confidently and calmly in the eye and yawned a lot. One investigator asked him why he started yawning so frequently every time they met. The boy replied that it was a psychological battle. The officer asked him to explain what he meant, and Michael said that when someone is concentrating very hard on something, if you yawn or say something, that person loses focus. But the biggest questions arose when he could not explain certain contradictions in his own statements. For example, Michael said that the perpetrator had been wearing a baseball cap the entire time. The investigator asked how, in that case, the boy could know that the man had short, tousled hair. Michael had no answer. The detective also asked why there were no bruises on the boy's neck if the killer had strangled him with both hands. But this question only made the child angry. Investigators conducted an in-depth psychological assessment of Michael and were astonished to learn that the incident appeared to have had no effect on him whatsoever. The child simply showed no signs of psychological trauma. Considering all of these factors, the investigators concluded that the victim's statements could not be considered reliable. They decided that his description of the perpetrator should be disregarded. Experts suggested that when Michael pretended to be dead, he may have imagined an attacker who matched his worst fears. As a result, he may have described not a real person, but someone who, in his imagination, looked frightening enough to fit that role. Setting aside the attacker's description, investigators were able to make rapid progress. On September 5th, they arrested 31-year-old Kees Boersboom from Vlaardingen, an automotive parts warehouse worker. Almost every day, he cycled through the park on his way to work. He was the same cyclist who had called emergency services when the naked, bloodied Michael emerged from the bushes. The police discovered his disturbing tendencies almost by accident. One of the officers noticed the man's surname in the file and reported that a year earlier he had offered money for sexual contact with his young son. Investigators found it striking that, out of all people, he had been a witness at the crime scene. The man was interrogated. At first, Kees denied everything, but the police brought in a psychiatrist to the interrogation room, who helped the suspect admit that on that day he had been sexually aroused and was looking in the park for minors to whom he could propose sexual contact. After a few more hours, he confessed to strangling Ninka. The next day, Kees retracted his statement, but it was too late. The machinery of justice could no longer be stopped. He was formally charged. A large amount of incriminating evidence quickly appeared against him. It turned out that a few days after Ninki's murder, he had hastily disposed of adult videos, magazines, and notes related to the case. Although the officers never found the knife, a forensic expert stated that the wounds on the victim were consistent with a knife used in Kees's line of work. A hair found on Ninka's body matched the color and structure of his hair. Finally, two witnesses came forward. One had seen Kees's bicycle near the scene of the attack. The second identified him as the man who returned to the location where the body was discovered the following day. He had encountered her while coming out of the bushes. On the other hand, in the defendant's favor, there was the fact that the police had found no direct physical evidence against him. He also did not match the attacker description given by Michael. But, as we know, the prosecution chose to disregard this. The man's lawyer insisted that his client was not the kind of cold-blooded person capable of such an act. If Kees were the killer, it would mean he lured children into the bushes, assaulted and murdered them, and then, just minutes later, transformed from a lustful killer into an ordinary passerby. One who did not even flinch when a child he believed he had just killed walked out of the bushes directly toward him. Michael could have recognized him. Yet Kees did not panic, and instead calmly called the police and gave officers his real name and phone number. Could Kees be a modern-day Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, capable of deceiving everyone by putting on and taking off the mask of a murderous monster? It seemed the judges would have a difficult task, but on May 29, 2001, they found the defendant guilty. The judges took into account that the evidence was mostly circumstantial, but deemed it sufficient for a conviction. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, followed by compulsory psychiatric treatment. He would be held in a psychiatric facility and would not be released until doctors determined that he was no longer a danger to society. In Kees's case, this was effectively a life sentence. The problem was that in order to work through one's issues with a psychiatrist, one must acknowledge them. And Keyes firmly maintained his innocence regarding the murder of Ninka and the attack on Michael. And there were people who believed him, the well-known Dutch crime journalist Peter R. de Vries, now deceased, and forensic psychiatrist Professor Peter J. van Koppen. They questioned the evidence and the methods used during the investigation. The main piece of evidence against the defendant was the confession. However, there are many issues with it. The interrogation in which the confession was obtained was the only one that, by some coincidence, was not recorded on tape. According to Keyes, the detectives used various tactics to force him to admit guilt. They made him doubt his own memory and explained the advantages of confessing. The interrogation lasted an extremely long time. He was not allowed to rest or sleep, and was given coffee while they waited until he was ready to agree to everything, just so he could finally be left alone. But the main problem with this confession is that it contradicts the evidence and the statements of young Michael. The boy said that the attacker threatened them with an old-fashioned knife with a wooden handle. Keyes described a completely different knife. Also, according to Keyes' confession, he allegedly first sexually assaulted Ninka and attempted to strangle her first. Yet we already know that this was not how it happened. But why would he lie if he had already decided to confess? In addition, DNA evidence supported Keyes' possible innocence. Police found DNA under Ninki's fingernails and on the shoelace used to strangle her that did not match Keyes' DNA. At trial, an expert suggested that the DNA could have been transferred under her nails much earlier at school. However, Ninki and Michael had been playing in water in the park, meaning her nails should have been relatively clean. Despite initial police claims that they had thoroughly combed the entire park, it later turned out that this was not entirely true. For example, witnesses had seen a young man sitting for a long time on a bench near the pond where Ninki and Michael had been playing. The police examined the bench rather carelessly. The young man had left behind a drink can. The DNA on the can could have been compared with the DNA under Ninka's fingernails, but this was never done because the police were already convinced they had found the killer. They also did not ask divers to search the park's bodies of water, even though the attacker could have thrown the knife into one of them. Witness testimony became a separate mockery of justice. The police invited for identification a female witness who had seen a man coming out of the bushes the day after the murder, and another witness who had noticed a bicycle near the scene of the attack. Initially, the female witness described a man with shoulder-length hair, but during the lineup, she unexpectedly decided that Keyes, a man with a short haircut, could be the person she had encountered in the park. The farce reached its peak during the bicycle identification. 6 months had passed between the murder and the identification procedure, and the witness had since moved to the United States. As a result, the police sent him an email with photographs of only Keyes' bicycle, without any comparison options. Moreover, the images were labeled Suspect KB's bicycle, front view and rear view. The witness, of course, identified the bicycle as the one he had seen in the park 6 months earlier. He went even further and claimed he recognized the model and color of the bicycle, which is particularly interesting since the images sent by investigators were black and white. In fact, that bicycle had also been noticed by another witness. The man initially told investigators that the bicycle looked like Keyes' bicycle. However, the prosecutor presented this testimony to the judges, omitting the final part of the sentence. The witness actually stated clearly that it was a different bicycle with a completely different lot. This was not the only instance where the prosecutor distorted facts in his favor. He convinced the judges that a hair found on Ninki's left thigh matched Keyes' hair, even though DNA analysis had already shown that it was a female hair. And this is without mentioning that Keyes actually had an alibi. Admittedly, not a strong one, but still an alibi. Keyes worked at an automotive parts warehouse. He could only leave work after the last truck had departed, between 5:18 p.m. and 5:22 p.m., taking the most unfavorable time for him, 5:18 p.m. If he immediately headed to Princess Beatrix Park and rode quickly, he would arrive in about 11 minutes, around 5:29 p.m. However, we already know that Ninka and Michael asked a park employee for the time, and it was 5:15 p.m. The attacker approached them just 1 or 2 minutes later. Keyes simply could not have arrived at the park in time. Witnesses saw the bicycle already lying on the grass at 5:30 p.m., when the man was still on his way. One of the witnesses who saw the bicycle was walking a dog with a black and white coat, likely the same dog Michael had seen from the bushes. Another interesting detail: Keyes admitted that when he arrived at the park, he followed a boy he found attractive for some time. Most likely, this was the younger brother of Ninka, whom their mother sent to hurry her at 5:30 p.m., since Ninka and Michael were already late for dinner. The boy had arrived at the park on his small bicycle within a few minutes, so if Keyes had been following Ninka's brother, he could not at the same time have been committing the murder. The police found it remarkable that, of all people, someone with such a background involving children happened to be present at the crime scene. But he was not the only one there. In the immediate vicinity of the scene in the park was taxi driver Hans Franken. At the moment when the naked and injured Michael emerged from the bushes and Keyes was only just arriving on his bicycle, Hans was standing nearby on a small bridge. A year after the incident, on April 22, 2001, Hans gave an interview as a witness, stating that he had seen and heard nothing and had not noticed the perpetrator leaving the scene. However, this interview was seen by several boys. They claimed that Hans had invited them to his home, shown them adult films in their presence, and engaged in sexual self-stimulation. In other words, the witness himself turned out to be a child molester. Unlike Keyes, who was described as non-aggressive, such a claim could not be made about Hans. Even his own family could not vouch for him. Hans's brother and sister contacted the police, asking them to investigate his possible involvement in the case. They were concerned about his behavior. He spoke frequently about the deceased victim, looked at her photographs, and returned to the park several times. Hans even attended the funeral, although he was not supposed to, as only the girl's relatives and school children were present. The police, however, seemed uninterested in the family's request. Meanwhile, Hans's mental health deteriorated sharply, and on September 30, 2002, he decided to end his life, leaving no farewell note. It later emerged that he had voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which did not match the DNA found on Ninka. For the police, this was considered definitive proof of his innocence, although for some reason, DNA evidence did not have the same effect in Keyes' case. But even this was not all. In the same area where the crime took place, another child predator was operating, a man with the surname Heemskerk. This predator was far more dangerous than Keyes and Hans combined. Heemskerk knew Hans Franken. They had a relationship and had spent time together. Unlike Hans, however, Heemskerk had a long criminal record. Many people, including police officers, informed the detectives investigating Ninka's murder about this man, but they showed no interest. They already had Keyes Borsboom. Everything pointing to other suspects was ignored. The high-profile investigative reporting by journalist Peter R. de Vries brought renewed attention to the case. The police were forced to review their work, but the result remained the same. Keyes continued to maintain his innocence and filed appeals, but all were rejected. In July 2004, after Keyes had already spent 4 years in prison, a twist occurred that no one had expected. Wick H., a 25-year-old man from Rotterdam, was arrested in connection with 2 violent sexual assaults. During his arrest, a DNA sample was taken and checked against the database, revealing a match with DNA found on Ninka, under her fingernails and on the shoelace used to strangle her. And it is astonishing, the police had considered the DNA on Ninka insufficient to prove Keyes' innocence, yet it was sufficient to be entered into the database. Following the match, Wick confessed to the murder and the attempted murder. His confession was detailed and included information that only the real perpetrator could have known. A review of the case confirmed that Wick was the offender. On January 21, 2005, the court sentenced the 26-year-old killer to 20 years in prison and mandatory psychiatric treatment. He has already served his custodial sentence and is undergoing treatment in a psychiatric facility. In light of the new information, on December 10, 2004, Keyes Borsboom was released. He had spent more than 4 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. After his release, he faced the difficult task of rebuilding his life. The government provided financial compensation for its mistake, but no amount of money can make up for the lost years or the stigma of being labeled a murderer that remains with him regardless. Keyes' wrongful conviction highlighted deep problems in the Dutch justice system. His attraction to minors is certainly wrong and illegal, but it does not automatically make him a murderer. Keyes maintains that he is only attracted to young people over the age of 16. But even if he is not being fully truthful, the fact remains that he never committed violent assaults or acts of physical abuse. Nevertheless, investigators rushed to form a conclusion about him and conducted an investigation aimed at fitting evidence to their theory, rather than following the evidence to find the real killer. The biggest problem with such biased investigations is that the true perpetrator remained at large all along. Had they arrested Wick H. in time, he would not have been able to abuse additional victims or cause so much suffering to other families. Unfortunately, amid the scandal surrounding the wrongful conviction, almost everyone forgot that this case was about the attack on Ninky and Michael. And while Michael miraculously survived, Ninky did not. As a child, Michael always avoided media attention. Now he has stepped into the public eye, but not to talk about what happened to him, but to announce his political ambitions. He emphasized that he has no desire to look back at that horrific event. His small school friend Ninky Kleiss remains forever a 10-year-old girl who loved music and butterflies. To honor her memory, a bright butterfly-shaped bench was installed in Princess Beatrix Park. The design was based on a drawing made by the girl herself. The sculptor also added 2 pearls, symbolizing the 2 victims of the attack, Ninka and Michael.
On August 31, 2022, the police of Thurston County, Washington, started receiving calls from concerned motorists who had noticed an abandoned car on the highway. When officers arrived at the specified location, they realized that their concerns were not unfounded. The driver's side door was open, the key was still in the ignition, and there was dried blood on the steering wheel and door. A broken phone was lying on the ground next to the car. The phone had been last used at 5:10 p.m. and was discovered at 5:30 p.m. This means that whatever happened here happened very quickly. By checking the registration number, the police found that the car was registered to Kenneth Davis from Olympia, Washington, a city located 25 minutes away from where the car was found. However, when they contacted the man, they learned that his 16-year-old son, Gabriel Davis, had taken the car. Around 4 p.m., he had left for football practice at school but never showed up. It is obvious that blood and a broken phone are not a good sign. When something like this happens, several scenarios immediately come to mind, including a fight or possibly even a murder. The police hurried to gather as much information as possible about the boy. Gabriel Davis is a 16-year-old teenager from Olympia, Washington. Recently, his academic performance at school sharply declined, but his enthusiasm for football remained unchanged. He took his training seriously and never missed a session. Therefore, when he didn't show up at the stadium on August 31st, his absence was immediately noticed. Nobody, including his best friend Justin Yoon, knew his whereabouts. After the discovery of Gabriel's car, the broken phone, and the blood, the police immediately launched an extensive search. The search continued throughout the night, and the following morning, involving search teams and helicopters. As news of the boy's disappearance aired, calls started pouring in from people who claimed to have seen him. Around 5 individuals reported that they saw the teenager walking along the highway. He was alone and heading towards the park. One caller even spoke to Gabriel and asked if everything was all right, to which he replied, yes. The most horrifying aspect was that the mysterious disappearance of the young man was not the first or even the second occurrence in the county. Over the past 6 years, 2 other young boys vanished within a 5-mile radius of where Gabriel's car was found. Local residents were convinced that he became the 3rd victim of the same abductor and demanded immediate action from the police. The missing boys were named Matthew Anfelt and Logan Schendelman. Like Gabriel, Matthew and Logan were actively involved in sports during their senior years. The cases bore striking similarities, particularly with Logan's situation. His car was also found abandoned on the roadside, and it was unclear why he was in the southern part of the county where he had no reason to be. Furthermore, in both cases, witnesses reported seeing the boys before their disappearances. However, Matthew and Logan were never found. Due to these similarities and the urgency of Gabriel's investigation, the FBI was involved at such an early stage. While the extensive search for the missing teenager under mysterious circumstances was underway, the manager of a company specializing in diesel engine repairs, North Carolina Power Systems, contacted the police. She reported that one of their employees, Daniel McCaw, had been absent from work for 4 days and was not responding to calls. Considering this was out of character for him, and he had never gone missing before, she asked the officers to visit his home and check on him. The officers arrived at his house in Orting, Washington, a 45-minute drive east of Olympia, and knocked on the door, but there was no response. Daniel's German Shepherd dog ran out through the doggy door. Simultaneously, they detected a foul odor of decomposition, prompting them to search for an entry point into the house. The officers gained entry through an unlocked door leading to the laundry room. Inside, they found Daniel lying on the floor. He was in a pool of blood and had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. Initially, they assumed that he had taken his own life as there were no signs of forced entry. However, there was no weapon near the body, and subsequent investigation revealed a gunshot wound to the abdomen, and multiple stab wounds. Insects actively swarming around the man's neck suggested a possible throat wound, but due to the advanced state of decomposition, it was difficult to determine with certainty. At the crime scene, they found 9mm and 45mm casings, as well as 2 empty holsters. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator or perpetrators had used 2 different firearms, which were likely stolen from the victim. The man lived in an elevated area of the neighborhood, and neighbors reported that only residents and the mailman accessed the area. Initially, it was unclear how the perpetrator could have muffled the gunshots. However, it turned out that locals were accustomed to using firearms, but they did not interfere in each other's affairs. They lived in relative seclusion, so even if someone heard something, they wouldn't think to call the police. The boss of Daniel mentioned something very interesting during the conversation with the police. Just 2 weeks ago, Daniel broke up with his fiancée Amanda Olufsen. Amanda also works at North Carolina Power Systems. She has a son named Gabe, and her Gabe is the same Gabriel who disappeared a day ago. It's a curious turn of events, and now the investigators had to determine if there is any connection between the disappearance of the 16-year-old boy and the murder of the 51-year-old man. Fortunately, they could ask Gabriel himself about it. They found him in the evening of August 2nd in Thurston County, just 3 miles away from where his car was found. Gabriel was discovered in the woods. He was alone, in the dark, wearing only shorts without a shirt, shoes, or even socks. When the detective asked him what had happened to him, Gabriel replied that he didn't remember anything, and didn't know where he had been. His answer seemed strange to the police. There were no scratches on Gabriel, but if he had been wandering in the woods for 36 hours, there should have been at least some abrasions on his feet. This also didn't match the blood found in his car. It appeared that Gabriel may have been under the influence of drugs and couldn't remember the events of the past 36 hours. Until the teenager decided to change his story. He confessed that he was the one who broke the phone because he was afraid the police might find something incriminating on it. He added that he couldn't say what had happened to him because he feared harm would come to him. This was an extremely unusual and troubling statement. However, without the ability to demand an explanation from the boy, and while investigators were trying to figure out what had occurred, they released Gabriel back home to his family. However, the next day, Gabriel's father, Kenneth, called the police. He stated that his son was indeed involved in Daniel's death, but he only did it because he was coerced by Daniel's biker friends, who wanted to steal something from the victim's safe. Kenneth claimed that the biker gang approached his son because Gabriel knew the layout of the house well since he had lived there. They threatened to harm the boy if he refused to do what they wanted. It was then that Gabriel shared his troubles with his friend Justin Yoon, and together they devised a plan. However, the evidence collected by the police told a completely different story. The police did establish a connection between the victim and the Amigos Motorcycle Club, a club associated with the notorious Bandidos Motorcycle Club, but they found no evidence that they played a role in the murder. Furthermore, a few hours after the body was discovered, one of Daniel's friends, also a member of the club, visited the victim's home. He was genuinely distraught when the detective informed him of Daniel's death. In any case, it was essential to determine what was in the victim's safe. Daniel's mother provided the police with the safe combination, mentioning that they would be shocked and surprised by its contents. She mentioned that Amanda called her and said no one knew how to open it. When the detectives opened the safe, they found around 212 different types of weapons and ammunition, as well as some coins stored in plastic packets. A jewelry box was empty, and several packets contained pills with illicit substances. The notepad contained details about his biker club. On the bottom shelf, there was clearly something the size of an ammunition box. The investigators were fortunate that Daniel took his safety very seriously. In addition to weapons, he had several cameras in his house. They helped the police determine how the events unfolded on the night of the murder. The detectives found out that on August 28, Justin and Gabriel went to Lake Panther for a weekend getaway with their family and friends. Shortly after midnight, they left the campsite and returned around 6:30 in the morning. Their relatives didn't know where they had been, but the surveillance cameras at Daniel's house showed exactly where they went. At 1:50 a.m., two young, slim guys approached the victim's house from the backyard. One of them had a canister of pepper spray or something similar on his belt. The guys had their faces partially covered with masks. One of them was wearing a baseball cap and a medical mask, while the other wore a ski mask. They used handheld flashlights. The young men entered through the dog door. Nothing happened for a while until the homeowner exited the garage at 2:41 a.m., entered the house, and didn't appear on the video again. Just 6 minutes later, the camera captured his German Shepherd quickly running out of the house through the dog door. The unknown guys exited through the side door, then wandered back and forth between the house and the garage for a few minutes, carrying some items that looked like either a toolbox or a military ammunition crate. Finally, they fled the crime scene at 2:52 a.m. They took something resembling either a toolbox or a military ammunition crate with them. Gabriel told his father that when Daniel entered the house from the garage, Justin chased after him, stabbed him, and then a gunshot was heard. Gabriel went to the garage because the safe was located there. He claimed to have heard 2 gunshots at that time. The guys disposed of the weapons near Daniel's house and returned to their normal lives on August 29th. However, Gabriel disappeared before the 31st. According to his statement, bikers tracked him down, pulled him out of his car, and hit his head on the steering wheel, leaving blood in the car. Then the kidnappers put him in a Suburban and drove around with him for a while, beating him, before finally releasing him. They also inexplicably took his shirt, shoes, and searched the car for the stolen item from the safe, but since he didn't steal anything, they found nothing. Thus, the teenager decided to present a version that he was also a victim, just like Daniel. However, this version doesn't fit together as a whole. If bikers really forced the teenager to commit the crime, why couldn't he quickly enter the house and escape? If, as Kenneth said, they planned it, was it not about completing everything as quickly as possible? It didn't make sense. Again, if the plan was to steal something, why did they even enter the house when the safe was in the garage? Regardless, on the evening of September 2nd, officers came to Justin and Gabriel's homes to search and arrest them. They found a black mask in Gabriel's car and a black ski mask and a handheld flashlight in Justin's house. After the police arrested the teenagers on September 2nd, Gabriel showed the investigators where he had discarded the weapons. Near the old Olympia brewery in Tumwater, the detectives recovered a 9mm Ruger handgun and a .45 caliber Sig Sauer pistol, similar weapons to the one used to shoot the victim. They also found over a dozen knives. The guns were inside a box for ammunition, the same kind that went missing from the victim's safe. The true motive for the crime is not revealed, but although Daniel did have friends among the bikers, besides his friendship with them, the police found no evidence that they intended to steal anything from the man's house or, let alone, kill him. However, the motive for the crime may be hidden in Gabriel's past. Despite his young age, he has faced many challenges. When Gabriel was only 3 years old, his parents divorced and engaged in a terrible custody battle, and Gabriel and his older sister found themselves at the center of this feud. According to a court decision made in 2010, the children spent weekdays with their mother and weekends with their father. The decision was not revisited when Amanda remarried twice and then separated from a husband who was abusive towards her. However, when she moved in with Daniel in 2018, Kenneth took her to court, claiming that the children's grades dropped, and they constantly skipped school. He also alleged that Daniel was aggressive and threatened Gabriel with a weapon and even threatened the boyfriend of the now 20-year-old sister. When Daniel got involved in the custody battle, he admitted to shouting at the sister's boyfriend but denied threatening him. The boyfriend broke into the house and stole a phone charger, which sparked the conflict, but now he regrets how he handled the situation. In any case, in 2018, a judge decided to have 12-year-old Gabriel and his 16-year-old sister live with their father on weekdays and with their mother on weekends. But the turmoil did not end there. In January 2019, Gabriel's sister was expelled from school due to poor grades. The girl told the school psychologist that her father behaved aggressively, especially when he drank, and that he had forcefully grabbed her wrist. It is unknown whether this was true or if Amanda and Daniel influenced her to gain full custody. But this had only a temporary effect. The final court decision was to have the children live with their father. All this happened against the backdrop of Amanda and Daniel's arguments. Daniel's boss said that his loyalty to the biker club could have been the reason for their breakup. The woman refused to compromise with the club and gave him an ultimatum, her or the club. It is not known what his response was, but on August 13, approximately 2 weeks before the murder, neighbors saw her moving things out of his house. During this time, Gabriel befriended Justin Yoon, who also had a history of getting into trouble from an early age. In middle school, he threatened a classmate with a knife, and in high school, he was accused of making false bomb threats. Therefore, he had to change schools as soon as the school year began. The boy was very interested in weapons, and there are many photos of him at the shooting range. Together with Gabriel, they were troublemakers at school. It is possible that Daniel's murder was revenge for how his relationship with Amanda ended, or perhaps the woman knows more than she is telling. In any case, only a teenager could come up with a story of a biker gang sending a child to do their job. Currently, Gabriel and Justin are being held at the Remon Hall Juvenile Detention Center. They are facing several charges, including first and second-degree murder. The bail for each teenager is set at $1 million due to the high likelihood of them attempting to escape. Gabriel has already staged a disappearance in the past to avoid punishment for his actions, and Justin's family was seen packing their belongings into a car when officers arrived to arrest him, indicating that they were likely planning to flee. The teenagers will be tried as adults. It's worth noting that in May 2021, the Supreme Court in Washington ruled that individuals under the age of 21 cannot be automatically sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. So, if they are found guilty, they may be eligible for release after serving 20 years.
There is not much information about Bryce Laspisa's childhood, but it is generally believed that it was not marked by any troubling incidents. As the only child in the family, he was surrounded by love and affection. Bryce was born on April 30th, 1994, to Karen and Michael Laspisa. In 2012, he graduated from high school in Naperville, Illinois. In 2013, the Laspisa family moved to Laguna Niguel, California, while Bryce lived about 500 miles away from his parents because he was preparing to begin his sophomore year at Sierra College. According to everyone who knew him, life seemed to be going well for Bryce. He had performed excellently during his freshman year and had a girlfriend, a blonde young woman named Kim Sly, whom he clearly adored. August 26, 2013, also appeared to be a completely ordinary day for the young student. That day, he spoke with his mother, who later recalled that he seemed happy, and their conversation was as normal as ever. The strange aspects of this case begin on August 27th. The events of that day were, at the very least, ambiguous, shocking, and difficult to believe. Even nearly 7 years later, no one had been able to determine what happened to Bryce, a young man who had seemed happy and content with his life just 24 hours earlier. On August 27th, the day after Bryce began his next semester, his girlfriend, Kim Sly, probably the person who knew him best at the time, noticed a strange change in his behavior that worried her. It is not entirely clear what Bryce did to unsettle her so much, but he admitted to taking a pill meant for treating attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, that had not been prescribed to him. Bryce's roommate, Sean Dixon, said that Bryce had taken the drug in order to stay awake all night and play video games. On top of that, he had been drinking alcohol throughout the day. Friends of Bryce mentioned that it had become a habit for him to drink a bottle of hard liquor every weekend. That same day, Bryce's behavior became even stranger when he gave away some of his most valuable belongings to friends, including a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to his mother. By the afternoon of August 28th, the people who knew Bryce were becoming extremely concerned about his behavior. Sean called Bryce's mother to share his worries, and there were many. He told Karen that his roommate had been acting very strangely and that he had broken up with Kim the previous night, sending her a message saying that she would be better off without him. According to Sean, Bryce admitted that something was bothering him, but he never explained what it was. A couple of hours later, Bryce called his mother himself. Despite having broken up with Kim the night before, he had driven 90 miles to her home in Chico. Bryce assured Kim that he was fine, but she took the phone and called Karen. She told Bryce's mother that he was acting completely out of character and that she did not think he should be driving. Karen suggested visiting Bryce the following day, August 29th. He told her that he really wanted to talk to her, but convinced her not to come. Once again, he did not explain what he wanted to discuss. After Karen finished speaking with her son, Kim took the phone again. Karen instructed her to give Bryce his car keys back, but only if he promised to call her the next morning. At 1 a.m. on August 29th, the phone rang at the Laspisa family home. Karen missed the call and quickly forgot about it, assuming that her son had returned to his apartment and had called just to let her know he had gotten home safely. Later, phone records would show that Bryce had actually called his parents while he was in a remote desert area, roughly an hour's drive from his apartment in Rockland, California. Around 11 a.m. on August 30th, Karen and Michael Laspisa received a voicemail from Bryce informing them that he had used their roadside assistance program at 9 a.m. after running out of fuel west of Bakersfield, California. This meant he had traveled approximately 350 miles. A gas station attendant named Christian delivered 3 gallons of fuel to Bryce while he waited in his car. Bryce paid $20 for the fuel using his parents' credit card. At that time, Bryce was in Buttonwillow, and judging by the town's location and its distance from Chico, Karen and Michael assumed their son was heading toward them. If he had continued in that direction, he would have reached his parents' home in less than 3 hours. Several hours later, Bryce still had not arrived, and his parents began pacing in anxiety. In desperation, they called the gas station and asked Christian to return to the spot where he had delivered fuel to Bryce to check on him. Christian agreed to help, but when he returned, he found Bryce still sitting in his car in the same spot. When Christian asked Bryce what he was doing, he simply replied, "Nothing." Christian informed Karen that Bryce appeared to be fine, although his eyes were noticeably red. Karen finally spoke with her son around 12:30 p.m. The parents expected him to arrive home around 3 p.m., but as time passed, he still did not show up. For the next 6 hours, Bryce inexplicably ignored all calls from his parents. When Karen and Michael tracked their son's phone, they discovered that he had traveled only 8 miles in the entire 9 hours. It was unclear why he had not answered any calls during this time. By 9 p.m., the family was terrified. Unsure what else to do, they contacted the California Highway Patrol. Officers found Bryce in his car on Lagoon Drive, still in Buttonwillow. The police searched his vehicle for drugs but found nothing. They stayed with him for 20 minutes and conducted a standard field sobriety test, which he passed. Bryce, who was 19 years old at the time, was legally an adult. Since he was neither intoxicated nor in possession of drugs, the police had little authority beyond advising him to call his mother and continue home. Bryce resisted calling her, so the officers dialed the number themselves, forcing him to speak with his mother around 10 p.m. She asked what he was doing, and Bryce oddly replied that he was planning to hang out with friends later. At 11 p.m., Bryce stopped at a gas station in Buttonwillow and purchased a drink. He told his mother he was on the interstate but offered no further details. At some point that night, Bryce stopped at another gas station and refueled for $39. During the night, Bryce again used his parents' roadside assistance program and was once more located in Buttonwillow. He remained in that area for approximately 13 hours without explanation. This time, GPS monitoring staff tracked Bryce to an intersection to ensure he was traveling safely and in the correct direction. According to his GPS, he was expected to arrive at his parents' home by 3:25 a.m. On August 31st at 1:50 a.m., Bryce called his mother again to say that he had exited Interstate 5 but had returned to it. At 2:08 a.m., Karen spoke with her son for the last time. He called to say he had exited the interstate again and planned to spend the night in his car. By that point, Bryce had been awake for nearly 48 hours, so Karen did not argue with his decision to get some sleep. Bryce, however, did not slow down to sleep. He continued driving for another 90 minutes to Lake Castaic. At 8 a.m. on August 31st, a California Highway Patrol officer knocked on the Laspisa family's door. The news he brought was not good. The officer asked Karen and Michael whether they owned a beige 2003 Toyota Highlander. When the couple confirmed that it was their vehicle, the officer informed them that at 5:30 a.m., the car had been found abandoned near Lake Castaic. It had gone off the road just 2 hours from the Laspisa family home. The vehicle had rolled over and was found lying on its side. The rear window of the car had been shattered, the officer said, but Bryce was nowhere to be found. Police believed he had been inside the vehicle at the time of the crash and had managed to escape by breaking the rear window. A small amount of blood was found on the passenger headrest and the back seat, but not enough for investigators to conclude that Bryce had been seriously injured. Inside the car were Bryce's laptop, mobile phone, and wallet. A duffel bag was found in the back seat, leading investigators to suggest that he may have taken something from it when he broke the rear window and fled the scene of the crash. Surveillance footage showed that Bryce made 3 trips to the area where the vehicle was later discovered between the time he left Buttonwillow and 3 a.m. One camera captured the Toyota Highlander driving along a road near Lake Castaic at 2:15 a.m., just minutes after he last spoke with his mother. The same camera later recorded it again traveling up the road at 4:29 a.m. Tire tracks were found at the top of an embankment leading down toward the shore of Lake Castaic. Based on the tread marks, police concluded that Bryce had driven off the embankment at a relatively high speed without attempting to brake. Investigators drew the seemingly obvious conclusion that Bryce may have driven into the lake in an attempt to end his own life. Search operations were immediately launched in the area where Bryce's car had been found. Lake Castaic was searched for several weeks by divers, but the efforts were unsuccessful. A nearby campground was also checked, but no trace of the student was found. Midway through the search, Los Angeles firefighters were called to a fire that had broken out in the area surrounding the lake. To everyone's alarm, the source of the fire was a burning body. Fortunately for the Laspisa family, it was not Bryce. As it turned out, the victim was 35-year-old Lamondre Dion Miles. The man from Los Angeles had been shot multiple times during a dispute, after it became clear that he was unable to repay a debt. After the killing, his body was dumped and set on fire, despite evidence suggesting possible intentional actions by Bryce to either harm himself or stage his own disappearance. Karen and Michael Laspisa, along with investigators, also considered whether their son might have witnessed something he should not have seen, resulting in his death. Friends, relatives, and volunteers distributed flyers and searched remote trails for Bryce, while police used helicopters to scan the area from above. On the 9th day of the search, investigators brought in search dogs, which successfully tracked Bryce's scent from the car to a road that crossed a dam and led to a truck stop. Unfortunately, no further leads were discovered. With no new evidence and no sign of the 19-year-old, the search was officially called off after 3 weeks, although volunteers continued looking independently and police kept patrolling the area. At the same time, investigators interviewed those closest to Bryce to understand his state of mind in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. They learned that, in addition to giving his mother's diamond earrings away, he had also given away his Xbox. They also discovered that on the same night he left, Bryce had sent his roommate Sean a message saying, "I love you, man, seriously. You're the best person I've ever met, and you saved my soul." People who are considering suicide often give away their belongings and leave emotional messages for loved ones, but Sean insisted that he did not feel Bryce intended to die or never return. He told investigators that, in his opinion, Bryce simply needed time alone and would likely come back soon, but Bryce never returned. And 7 years later, no one knows what happened to Bryce Laspisa. Months after Bryce's disappearance, Karen and Michael hired private investigator Denise Savastano, who kindly offered to work pro bono. Denise, who specializes in missing persons cases, believes that Bryce intended to return home to his parents. Her theory is based on Bryce's GPS coordinates. Denise thinks that the young man's drug use could have triggered a psychotic break, which might explain his irrational behavior. At the same time, she acknowledges that Bryce could have sustained a head injury during the crash, leaving him disoriented and causing him to wander off. Alternatively, Bryce might have experienced a double blow. He could have been in a state of psychotic distress before the accident, and then sustained a head injury, likely a concussion during the crash, which would have worsened his mental state. Denise and Bryce's family also hired an echolocation specialist to search the depths of Government Cove near the lake, operating under the assumption that if Bryce had taken his own life, this would have been the place. After 2 days of searching, it became clear that the cove was not the young man's final resting place. Karen and Michael continued to maintain that they did not believe their son would have left voluntarily, and even if he had, he would not have stayed hidden for more than 6 years. Eventually, he would have reached out to someone. It is important to note that everyone who spoke to Bryce on the phone in his final days said he seemed okay. His family also does not believe the suicide theory. Yet, given the very limited evidence, it appears to be the most logically consistent explanation. Consider the following points. Bryce told his parents that he needed to discuss something important but never said what it was. He gave away several personal valuables, which could indicate suicidal thoughts, but could also suggest he was planning to start a new life with new belongings. In the hours leading up to his disappearance, Bryce wandered around Buttonwillow and spent a long time sitting in his car with no apparent reason. This could suggest several things. He may have been contemplating what he wanted to do: go home, end his life, or run away. Alternatively, he could have been waiting for a car that never arrived. Was someone supposed to pick him up to start a new life? Did he spend so much time in Buttonwillow simply waiting for a drug dealer? When California Highway Patrol officers searched his car, they found no drugs, and none were found after the crash. It seems he deliberately drove into the crash but was able to break the rear window and escape. Search dogs traced Bryce's scent to a truck stop, making it plausible that he may have hitched a ride with a truck driver. Additionally, in the fall of 2013, months after Bryce's mysterious disappearance, there were frequent reports of sightings of him in Oregon, though police were unable to confirm any of these leads. The theory that he died by suicide is supported by many of the same pieces of evidence that also suggest he left voluntarily. Mental health conditions often first emerge during adolescence and early adulthood, and alcohol and drugs could have acted as a trigger that brought underlying issues to the surface. His mobile phone and wallet were found inside the car. If he had died by suicide, he would have had no use for them anymore. If he had instead chosen to start a new life, he may have left them behind in order to avoid being tracked. Bryce's family is convinced that he may have been harmed by criminals. There are two possible scenarios here. First, Bryce may have encountered the killer of Lamondre Miles and lost his life simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is difficult to believe such an extraordinary coincidence that a violent murder occurred at the same time Bryce was driving around the Lake Castaic area. But in life, stranger things have happened. Second, it is possible that the student accepted a ride from a dishonest truck driver. At some point, he may have asked to be dropped off and continued hitchhiking toward his intended destination, only to be killed. In fact, the detail that Bryce ended up near a truck stop opens the possibility that his body could be anywhere across the United States. However, if a truck driver did give him a ride, it is unclear why that person has never come forward to report it to the police. It must be acknowledged that Karen and Michael's actions also do not always appear logical. If Bryce's girlfriend felt he was acting strangely and should not be driving, why did Karen instruct her to return his car keys? Why did Karen or Michael not go to pick up their son themselves, especially after learning that he had only driven a few miles over many hours and had spent most of the day sitting in his car? Perhaps the young man knew he was struggling with a serious drug problem and wanted to talk to his parents about it. At 19, every problem can feel like the end of the world. He may have felt that running away or even ending his life was easier than confessing to his parents. Maybe Bryce wanted to drop out of college and leave or take a different path in life, but knew his parents would not approve. One can only hope that Bryce is somewhere out there, living his life, happy and no longer using drugs. And if he is alive, perhaps one day he will make contact. He was the only child of Karen and Michael, with a loving girlfriend and a large circle of friends who desperately tried to find him.